Okay, well, like we're doing a deeper dive on some of the most violent bastards I've looked at. Criminals in Australia. I've only met two of them, and one of those very, very briefly. The others I've studied and interviewed people who knew them. Now, we don't want to glorify crime or criminals, but these people come, it's almost from another world, a terrifying world where if you manage to fall into their orbit, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, you don't want to owe these people money. So we have a list of 5 that Jack considers to be the most violent people who've ever set foot in this country. And look, I'm not one to disagree with him. We don't include serial killers or child killers. That's for the fucking true crime creeps to do.
Ooh, that is
They are
creepy.
terrible people, but they're violent, opportunistic dickheads with fucking pathological bullshit issues. This is more of your gangster trouble. So
Yes.
the marker for these people we're about to talk about is why they were genuinely feared by their criminal peers. They're gangland figures. They're not the kind of people who would go again the squareheads, as they like to call them, the normies.
Squareheads, yeah. Normies, yeah.
They're the sort of men who kill strategically, and they kill to boost their fearsome reputations, protect their business interests, and generally get a foothold and keep a foothold in the bountiful proceeds of crime. These are the sort of men who terrified already terrifying people, which is a mountain of being terrifying.
Yes, indeed it is. And so, look, in order to add a little bit of dramatic. A dramatic suspense, or a state of suspense.
True crime loves that shit.
I've created a list of 5 that I've looked at perhaps really closely. And at number 5, we have John Frederick Chow Hayes. Now, Chow was a Sydney gangster, certainly around the same time as Squizzy Taylor, who many listeners would know of. There have been fucking operas written about Squizzy Taylor, but there's very little been written about Chow Hayes, except for a biography that was written prior to his death. I'll talk about that briefly. But he was born in 1911. Pretty rough time to be born in Sydney. His father was actually a member of the Light Horse, the Australian Light Horse, and he was when World War One broke out, and off he went to serve. Chow Hayes had another serious male figure in his life, and that was his grandfather, who died of bubonic plague.
Oh,
so this is, no strong male role model figures for Chow. After the war, by the way, Chow's father was so badly damaged psychologically by the war that the only time Chow saw him was with his father wearing a straitjacket in an asylum.
Oh, brutal.
So that's the only time he ever met his father, apparently.
It's not perfect.
He started off knocking off a bit of gear in and around Central Station. He was basically called suburbs like Glebe and Darlinghurst and Surrey Hills his backyard.
Places we can't afford to live now.
Yeah. But in those days, horrific slums. As I said, bubonic plague. There were outbreaks of bubonic plague in Woolloomooloo.
Bring out your dead.
and in the dreadful slums of Frog Hollows in Surrey Hills. That have been torn down now, I think, about 6 times. And I don't know. I'd go looking at them in about 5 years because they could be slums again.
The ghosts still
look, Chow was a standover man, and he emerged understanding one thing: that if you were the most violent person in the room, you were gonna make a lot of money. And so, as an emerging crook, he bashed one Sydney gangster, more senior in the chain, bashed him mercilessly. Talks about waiting outside for 5 hours and had taken off his singlet and had wrapped it around a metal pole because at this stage they're starting to become worried about fingerprints. Beat the shit out of this guy, Joe Green his name was, and put him in hospital for about 6 months. And that was when Hayes, then he's 18 or 19, has decided he's going to be an extremely violent man. He was responsible for at least 5 murders that we know of, and the most famous of these was the murder of Bobby Lee. in
Yeah.
1954. And the story is just astonishing. Chow, he had a gang, of course, around him that among other things, they were employed at the Two-Up School um, in Surrey Hills, and they were employed as the sort of muscle, Tomo's Two-Up, it was known as, in various locations around Surrey Hills. Constantly moving. But there was a huge Two-Up schools where literally thousands of men would gather, particularly on a Thursday night, pay night, and punt on Two-Up. And Chow's men were charged as sort of bouncers. They were sorry, that's not quite true. Bobby Lee's men were charged as the sort of bouncers, and if there was a punch up, Bobby Lee's men would jump in and sort out blokes and throw them out.
Sort them out, yeah.
Chow had a gang too, as I say, but Chow was paid another. So that was part of the extortion racket. If there was any trouble of a gun or of a gun nature, then Chow would come down with the gun. So a bit of a punch up, Bobby Lee would take care of it and his men. But if things got pretty serious, then Chow would come down with the guns. And Chow's gang was at Tomo's Two-Up, and Bobby Lee's men ripped into them, gave them a bit of a touch up, bit of a hiding. And Bobby Lee would have known this. He was a boxer himself and a bit of a heavy, and he realised that Chow Hayes would retaliate, because he always did at the slight, not so much the injury that some of his gang got, but at the slight, the personal slight that he'd received from Bobby Lee. So they were, men that had basically decided to go toe to toe, and Bobby Lee got in first, or he tried to. And went around to Hayes' home in Glebe with a gun. It was either Bobby Lee or one of his men. And they looked inside. Let's say it was Bobby Lee. We certainly did in a television program. It may have been one of his henchmen, but we'll stick with the fact that it was Bobby Lee. Looked into Chow's home through the window, saw a male figure sitting in front of the radio, listening to the radio in an easy chair, and let rip and shot the bloke dead. But it wasn't Chow Hayes, even though it was Chow Hayes' home. Yep. It was in fact Chow Hayes' nephew.
Yeah, and if you're gonna come the king, don't miss.
He's shot dead. So Bobby Lee realises then that he's in terrible trouble. He goes into hiding. I've seen photographs of the funeral of Hayes' nephew, and there are women just wailing at the cemetery, and Chow's just standing on his own with this look on his face like he's about to go nuts. At this stage, 1954, he's come to the end of really 30 years as a violent standover man.
Yeah,
and he knows that there has to be retribution.
Yeah, you can't let this slip.
Can't let this go at all. So they put out the feelers. Hayes and his men put out the feelers. Where's Bobby Lee? Where's Bobby Lee? Let us know where Bobby Lee is. And about 6 weeks go by from after the shooting of the nephew, and Chow takes a call at his home, and he's told that Bobby Lee is going to be at a nightclub in Market Street in the CBD. The nightclub's an interesting one. Just briefly, it was a drag act, and even in those days in Sydney, 1954, these things were very popular. And sort of Sydney was one of those cities that was. Homosexuality was illegal and so forth. There were still pubs and places where homosexual men could meet, and it was sort of, everything was sort of everyone looked the other way. But it is an interesting thing, because Sydney was like this, and Melbourne and Brisbane weren't. Anyway, so they're ready to go and kill Bobby Lee at this club, and Hayes rings up his offsider, and that's a bloke by the name of Joey Hollowbone. And he says, we're going to go and sort out Bobby Lee once and for all tonight, and get around here at 8 o'clock, and we'll get down there. So Joey Hollowbone unbeknownst to Chow, Joey Hollibane's wife thinks Joey Hollibane is having an affair. And she's very, very worried about it. And when she asked Joe Hollibane, "Where are you going?" he said, "Well, we're going to the club. We're going to a nightclub, Chow and I." And he said, "Well, I'm coming too. You've got to take me," because she starts to put it on that you're having this affair, and I don't believe you anymore. I'm coming with you. And so she goes. So she's in the car with Joey, and they pull up outside Chow Hayes' place. Chow Hayes' wife looks out and she says, "Well, if she's going, I'm going too."
For fuck's sake!
So the four of them arrive at this club in Market Street.
This is frustrating.
It's a downstairs club, so they move downstairs. There's about 70 people there, and the four of them are sitting having a drink. And Chow is basically glaring at Bobby Lee. Bobby Lee's there. Bobby Lee's talking to about 6 or 8 men at another table. And Chow's just glaring at him. And on the other side, from the other side of the room, Bobby Lee knew he was there. And Bobby Lee was sort of glaring back and giving him shit. And Chow just said to Hollibane, he said, "You take the women outside and I'll sort this out now." So and Chow walked across the room. And he approached Bobby Lee, and Bobby Lee. These are the most famous last words of any Australian criminal. Bobby Lee says to Chow Hayes, "You're not going to shoot me in front of all these people, Chow." And Chow just goes bang, 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 bang. Blows him off his chair and then sits over him and empties the rest of it into him. And then it's just pandemonium, and they all run away. Everyone in the club disappears. Of the 70 or 80 people that were there that night, not one of them would come forward to give evidence against Chow Hayes. There were 2 criminal trials that led to mistrials or hung juries, and then finally the corrupt New South Wales police officer Ray Kelly says to Chow, "I'm going to charge your wife if you don't plead guilty." And Chow finally does.
Ooh, wow,
and pleads guilty because he was terrified that his wife would be charged with being an accessory after the fact of the murder. And so he pleads guilty and is sentenced to hang after his many run-ins with the law, many minor jail sentences. He's basically sentenced to hang. He doesn't hang, of course, because the New South Wales Labor government repealed capital punishment in the 50s, and Bill Leake, who painted the portrait sits on my wall, Chow Hayes.
It does.
Looking over me.
Terrifying.
It's vaguely terrifying.
It's really intense.
You don't look at that portrait and say, "There's a kindly old man."
He has shark's eyes.
Yeah.
Shark's eyes. They're dead. Dead eyes. Anyway,
Bill Leake described him as like a lizard, that he would only blink every sort of 10 seconds or so, once. Yeah. And that was about it. Right. But so he didn't hang. Bill did ask him. He said, "You ever had any sort of political leanings?" He goes, "Well, no, I never voted in my life, but I gotta love the Labor Party who just said spared him the trapdoor."
Very, very good. I believe later when he was asked whether he deserved to hang, he said probably.
Oh, look, there's so many great stories about Chow. Just incredible stuff. He ended up just becoming a sort of sad old man in prison to a large degree. He did 20 years for the murder of Bobby Lee, gets out in the 1970s, has no skills, in this new world. And so his way of making money was he'd go to a sort of local TAB and just stand there and walk up to people and go, "Give me $50. That
was he old now?
But he's old.
He's old and useless.
He goes to jail again after glassing a young bloke in a pub and gets another 4 or 5 years, and then he gets out in 1977. His story becomes told because he'd been this gangster figure really from the 1920s all the way into the mid 1950s, where he goes away for his biggest jail. Just an extraordinary character that tells an amazing story of Sydney and just how tough it was.
Yeah, so I have nothing to do with it. I like Sydney now. I can't afford to live here, but at least I'm not being fucking harangued and shot.
I guarantee
I'm not being stood over.
I guarantee you that part of Sydney is now a lot nicer than it used to be. Look, that's number 5. John Frederick Chow Hayes, extraordinary character. I could talk about him all day. Number
We
4
might.
is Christopher Dale Flannery, Rentakill, an extraordinary bloke, a contract killer. Chow Hayes was a standover man. Christopher Dale Flannery is a contract killer. He was born in 1948. He was the youngest of 3 children. His brother went on to become a lawyer and very, very well respected, particularly the Victorian Trades Hall Council.
Oh, okay.
His sister was a nurse, but Flannery.
These are both really useful. You got the nurse to patch people up. You've got the fucking lawyer to get you out of trouble. I mean, this is a great outfit.
And he sort of did use them, but they were cleanskins. The lawyer in particular, his brother Peter, the lawyer in particular. Flannery, well, as being the youngest, his father left the home. The father was known to be a very violent human being, and when he took off, and I think the story goes that the mother, who was an Irish woman, very, very strong woman, punted him out of the house because he's a violent, drunken bastard. But it put Flannery on as a teenager on a bit of a sort of youth crime spree, knocking off stuff out of shops and gets done for motor vehicle theft. He goes down as a youth to the Morning Star. The Morning Star youth, it's not a hostel. I mean, it was a youth incarceration centre run by
backpackers.
Yeah, run by the Franciscan monks and
shittest backpackers ever.
He's known to have been sexually assaulted there. So by the time he's 15, and he's gone off the deep end. He's been raped by a priest, and we know this because he told some of his peers about this in Pentridge later on.
Yeah.
Flannery, by the time he's 19, is convicted of rape, and he goes to jail for a fair time there, and meets everyone in jail.
Good.
He goes into Pentridge, and then because of misbehaviour, he goes into H Division. And this is another really incredible thing about him. He refuses to take any nonsense from the guards in H Division, who were just brutal sadists. And he went on strike. Basically, took all his clothes off one day and said, "That's it for me. I'm pulling the pin. You can't make me do anything."
Pulling the pin. Good pun.
Through his brother, the lawyer, there were a number of. It led to a parliamentary inquiry into conditions in H Division. A number of prison guards were sacked. And the place had to basically drag itself out of the 17th century,
that's it.
And so Flannery was regarded as a bit of a hero among a lot of prisoners, and there are people that I've spoken to who spent time in jail with him, who hold him in very high esteem on that alone, just his sheer courage and bravery. Look, he was involved in a number of armed robberies and got pinged for a couple of them. He's released from jail from the rape, and then he gets involved in a number of armed robberies. He gets pinged for a couple of them, and he says to one of his cellmates, "Look, I'm not very good at robbing banks. I think I'll kill people for a living." And that's essentially what he did. He committed his first murder that we know of in 1980. It was in 1980, and that formed the basis of a huge criminal trial. He was charged for that, but he was ultimately acquitted.
Okay.
He was then transported up to New South Wales, where he was charged with another murder that had occurred subsequently, and he was charged with the murder there. He was bailed immediately and put into the company of one. Well, I won't say his name, but his senior detective was Roger Rogerson, and Roger Rogerson and Flannery had been involved earlier on in a very violent arrest where Rogerson arrested Flannery. Flannery basically would kill anyone for $50,000. That was he wouldn't drop his price for anyone.
Well, it's back then money too, so like $50,000. But you could actually buy something with $50,000 back then.
yeah.
Now it's half an Audi.
50,000. Look, we know this because He was, a conversation with Dr. Jeffrey Edelston took place that was recorded from a car phone, from his car phone, where he was talking to his medical secretary about a young man that he'd just met, which was Christopher Dale Flannery, and Roger Rogerson had done the introductions. And Flannery was facing trial for the murder of Ray Loxley, the one that he'd been extradited to New South Wales for. And they were basically trying to work out a way of him avoiding that trial or having it suspended, not to have this particular judge look at it.
Yeah.
And so Edelston had been approached because he'd been doing tattoo removal. And in one case, at least, he had removed tattoos of a criminal figure in Sydney who was very unhappy with the level of scarring that he'd copped from the removal. And he'd been threatening Edelston. So Edelston had this conversation with the intros done by Rogerson. As this Flannery, he said, Flannery says 50,000 to kill him. He says, well, I don't want to kill him. I just want to have him beaten up. He goes, 10,000. He said, well, that's Edelston says to him, that's very expensive. And Flannery says, cricket stumps aren't cheap. Not cricket bats, interesting. He'd obviously used cricket stumps as a sort of weapon for beating people up. As it stood, that assault never took place, but Edelston had provided evidence to the court that Flannery couldn't stand trial because of a infection from tattoo removal, a very similar story, and Flannery avoided that particular trial and that particular judge. He was subsequently acquitted of the trial a couple of years later, not long before his disappearance, because basically the chief medical officer who was going to give evidence against him had died, and so the judge
died like mysteriously, or
no, it was not that I know of, but he'd passed away in the meantime.
Convenient.
So all of the evidence against Flannery for the murder of Loxley was a lot of it wouldn't stand up. A lot of physical evidence just wouldn't stand up. So the judge directed the jury to acquit. Flannery did a number of murders, probably 12. That sort of figure. It's very difficult to work out, and perhaps we'll explain as we go. Probably the most chilling one, I think, was when he murdered Sarah Smith and Terry Basham in Murwillumbah. They were painters and dockers, or Terry was, and painter and docker who were involved in drug dealing, and they decided that they were going to help themselves. So they were, set up business on their own. So the people who ran them organised for Flannery to kill them both, so 50,000 a head. And when Flannery went around to their home, he drove from the Gold Coast to Murwillumbah. We know this because he was in a restaurant. He met people in a restaurant and then paid for the restaurant bill with his credit card later in the day. In the meantime, he disappears to Murwillumbah, having created his alibi, and then goes to the home of Basham and Smith. He shoots them both dead. They have a young child. And a child is 2 years of age, but Flannery doesn't kill the child. He basically puts the child in the cot, and somehow or other, probably from a call from Flannery, Smith's father, the child's grandfather, was alerted and drove down from Brisbane about 24 hours later to rescue the child. Basically left there with his dead parents.
Honour among hitmen.
Yeah, well, there was a little bit of that. In the end, Flannery was working as a bodyguard for George Freeman. We are getting into the Sydney gang wars of 1984-85 now. Flannery is, in January of 1985, there's an attempt on Flannery's life where a gunman comes past and lets rip with an AR-15, an automatic weapon at least, and Flannery is actually hit in the webbing of his thumb and gets a nick across the ear. Flannery's out with his daughter and his stepson. They just returned from a club, and his wife. And there was a machine gun spray as a car sped past. Flannery became convinced that the shooter was another Sydney criminal who I won't name, and basically decided on a revenge. And at that time, there were two groups running around. There's Freeman and the old school, known as the Team, and there was this new group of villains who were wealthy with heroin trafficking money. Flannery ultimately spent the last 3 months of his life in an amphetamine haze. His thumb constantly ached from the bullet wound that he'd sustained in January. He is suspected of killing a man by the name of Tony Eustace in April of 1985. Eustace was shot 6 times in the back near the Sydney airport, the old Hilton Hotel. Look, very famous. Talking about last words there. He was dragged into hospital, Tony Eustace, Spaghetti Tony Eustace, sometimes known as Champagne Tony Eustace. He had a restaurant in Double Bay. He was told as he was dragged into emergency, 2 police officers approached him and said, tell us who did this, tell us who did this. And Eustace said his last words, fuck off. And that was that. He was going to go to the grave not letting on who it was. It's always been put on Flannery's feet that he was involved in that murder, but there are other theories about that.
Maybe that was the person who did it. Like the guy asked, he's like, fuck off. He's like, but who killed? He's like, fuck off. And he's like, but who killed me? Fuck off.
Look,
the guy's name was fuck off.
People that I've spoken to who knew Flannery said that he could actually be a very agreeable sort of fellow. He's always really well dressed. He worked while he was on the run. He worked in the menswear department of David Jones' store in Perth. So he's always well dressed and quite a good looking guy. One bloke I spoke to said, "Look, he was, we were sitting. It was in a club in Double Bay, and they were having a drink. And he said, look, he was a really nice guy. And then Flannery's wife turned up, and Flannery just became enraged, and then he was just a terrifying human being to be anywhere near. He had sworn a terrible vengeance for the shooting offence at his Arncliffe home in January, and he just couldn't be pulled up. The Sydney gang wars were underway, and the really serious, the senior figures like McPherson and Freeman and others were living in fear. No one was doing any business, and really they figured ultimately that Flannery was the one that if he went, everything could calm down again. And so he disappeared on May 9, 1985. He was last seen leaving an apartment block in Liverpool Street in the CBD, or just outside opposite Hyde Park, and that was the last time he's seen. I believe he was murdered by Stan Smith, who we'll get to shortly, and he was murdered at Freeman's home. That's pretty much putting the pieces together and talking to very senior police who investigated his disappearance for the National Crime Authority. That's what they said, that basically he went to Freeman's house. Freeman had told him that he had a machine gun that he wanted him to use and go and wipe out all the villains on the other side once and for all. And Flannery went down there, couldn't start his car in the car park of this apartment block. Long story short, it's likely that he got into a taxi. It's likely that he drove to the airport. It's likely that he rented a car there. And because he used to rent cars from the airport all the time, and then he drove to Freeman's house. Ultimately, the car would have been returned. No one saying anything about it. I actually, interviewed a police officer and said, "Did anyone ever check rental car records at Sydney Airport on that day?" And no one ever did. So Flannery just disappeared. That was the way it was. He was basically, I believe, shot dead at Freeman's house by Stan Smith, rolled up into a carpet, taken out beyond the heads and dumped. And that's kind of how Mr. Rentakill found his end. He's number 4. Gee whiz, this is taking a long time. Number 3.
It's all right. As long as it's good.
Number 3. My God, this is just a terrible, terrible human being. This is Nick Radev, known as the Bulgarian and sometimes the Russian. He was Bulgarian, not Russian. Before he arrived in Australia, it's likely that he was a wrestler. And the Bulgarians are very strong for
wrestler.
Olympic type wrestling, not your
Jesus.
Hulk Hogan jobs, you know.
Okay.
And
Yeah, fair.
very often these wrestlers, like boxers, are certainly in our sort of place, and in British organised crimes, it's often ex-boxers, or in this case, in Bulgaria's case, ex-wrestlers were used as sort of hard men. And
Yeah.
that's likely his background. They know that he'd been in prison in Turkey and in Bulgaria before he arrived in Australia. And he arrived in Australia under very mysterious circumstances. Basically, he arrived. He had a significant criminal history in Bulgaria and Turkey, as I say, but he arrived in Australia with a clean sheet.
Yeah, clean slate here. Yeah,
and when he arrived, he committed murder almost as soon as he arrived, and that was a sort of identity theft murder. There was a fellow, an actual Russian fellow who worked at the Ford motor plant in Broadmeadows in Melbourne.
Okay.
And Radev had assumed his identity and committed a number of offences in this guy's name.
Cheeky.
And it was a bit cheeky. And then the Russian fellow found out about it and confronted him, and well, he's never been seen again. He basically just didn't turn up for his scheduled shift at Ford, and never been seen again. And his name was Sergei, and he sort of looms large after that. Radev was a standover man, and as with Chow Hayes, he realised that the more violent, the more terrifying he could be, the better that would be for him. He was involved.
The more money you'd make.
He was involved in major drug trafficking and major drug supply. When 2 police officers were shot dead in Melbourne, the Silk Miller murders, the number one suspect in this was Radev. It turned out not to be Radev, but Radev was under police. Basically, the shadows, the interceptors were looking after him, keeping an eye on him all the way through. I interviewed a fellow by the name of Sadat Silan, who was a very small, sort of mousy-looking Turkish Australian guy who ran a mobile phone business. I looked into Sadat a fair bit. He had a significant criminal history for fraud type offences, dishonesty offences, and Sadat fell into the orbit of Nick Radev at Loddon Prison in Victoria. He'd arrived for sentencing after some fraud type offences, and that's where he met Radev. And Radev's sidekick at the time, Chow Hayes, who's another nasty piece of work. And they sort of took him under his wing. They took this Sadat Salan under his wing because they realised he had a bit of money, or he'd have access to it, and even if it was black money. Yeah. So it was an incredible story of grooming, where Radev said, "Look, I need you to buy a car off me, and I'll borrow some money off you," and it was always repaid with interest, those sorts of things, So
order amongst thieves.
Yeah, well, it was just to develop. It was grooming. It was just to develop
Yeah, that checks out.
Yeah, just to develop a sense of trust with him. They both got out of jail, and Radev had this habit of ringing up Sadat Salan at midnight and say, let's come out. And Sadat Salan tells stories about going to some disused warehouse and walking in there. There's just Russian guys everywhere, and there's stolen suits, Hugo Boss, Armani, all that sort of stuff.
What a bizarre thing to steal.
Yeah. Well, it's quite lucrative, really. You can, a $1,500 suit or $3,000 suit you can sell for $500. And so
anything that's not nailed to the floor, I suppose.
Well, that's right. These are guys were thieves. So basically, Sadat told that story. He said he went back to that warehouse the following day, and everything was gone. I mean, nothing was there. And they were sort of Russian mobsters, and Radev was sort of in with them. Sadat Salan tells another story of Radev picking him up in his Mercedes, in his 2-door Mercedes, SL500 Mercedes, and saying, let's go for a run. And, Nick Radev used to drink brandy, used to drink the best brandy, connoisseur brandy that you
Isn't
could
that
buy.
cognac?
Cognac, sorry, yes, he was a big cognac man.
Good brandy's cognac, right?
Yeah, so he's drinking $300, $400 bottles of cognac, and he'd drink two at a time. Basically, they're driving down the road. He's had two bottles of cognac and a bottle of scotch, and
Jesus.
driving down the Tullamarine Freeway in this very fast car, doing about 180 kilometres per hour. So
good.
Salane reckons they get
What could go
pulled
wrong?
over by the police. Radev has got with him an unlicensed pistol. He's got half an ounce of coke. He's shit-faced drunk. And the two sort of traffic guys sort of wander up to the one. One of them wanders up to the car and he said, do you have any idea how fast you were going, sir? And he said, well, I haven't got a fucking clue because I'm fucking shit-faced. and so they go, okay, we better go and ring this one through. And so that's the land describes how they're just basically waiting there for about half an hour on the shoulder of the Tullamarine Freeway. And then finally the guy comes back, Radev had given him a fake license. They'd run it through, and they were waiting for a good half an hour, and then they came back and just handed him his license. You can just go, sir. All right then, sir. Just keep an eye on that, speed there.
Yeah.
Half an ounce of coke in the car, gun, enough stuff to get you put away for at least a year. But
it does look like a fun night, though. I mean,
so
guns, coke, drink.
So that says, as they pull away, with Radev still driving shit-faced drunk, saying, well, if you ever wondered if you were the subject of a task force, you can stop wondering now. Because the traffic blokes had rung it through and they've been told, don't arrest him, we need to get him on something really serious.
Yeah,
and that serious thing would happen.
Yeah.
So that Salane got a call, another midnight-based call, and Radev said to him, I've got some friends from Russia, want to know about mobile phones, come over and see us. And they were in a five-star, stay in a five-star hotel. So it was room 708, I think it was, but don't quote me on that. And so Sadat drops over and knocks on the door, room 708, if that was it. And the door opens and there's Russian goons everywhere, and they just beat the shit out of him.
What?
And Radev's just sitting there with the hotel with the hotel dressing gown on, cognac, coke, cigar, and he's just holding up a piece of paper that says $120,000. That's what you owe me. You owe me $120,000. And I said to Sadat, well, did you owe him that? He said, no, but he probably did, or it was at least black funds that Sadat had obtained by fraud and deception.
Okay.
And Radev wanted it. So they beat him. They beat him for 9 hours, right?
Jesus.
And breaking for every now and then to give him a line of coke and then wash him up, clean him up in the bathroom and then send him out again. And Radev said 120,000. He wouldn't even say it. He just hold up the little piece of paper, 120,000. And no, I don't have it. Bang, crash, bang, crash. This went on for hours. So that's the land said, I realised I was never going to get out of there alive unless I said to him, look, I'll give you 20 now. I'll transfer 20 into your account. I'll give you the 100 in a week. So they let him go, long story short. And Sadat says, well, in a week, I'm going to have to deal with this, right? So
yeah.
I said, well, why didn't you go to the police? And he said, well, that wasn't going to help. I needed to do my own thing. So that Salane tells this story where he obtains a firearm, a pistol himself, and he waits for Nick Radev to turn up at his home, which happens promptly in a week. And Radev turns up with a pit bull. He's got a pit bull on a leash. He's got his gun and his phone down his tracksuit pants, and he bangs on the door. The door's open, but the screen door's locked. And Salane comes up and pulls the pistol on Radev, and through the screen door fires from about a metre away. Empties the gun. 8 shots. Bang, 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 bang. When the dust and noise or cloud of smoke clears, Radev has not been hit once, not from one of these shots. So But he said, look, the dog was the first one to piss off as soon as he started firing.
Yeah, that's
Bang.
it. Yeah.
And then one of the shots had actually gone across the road and gone into an apartment, gone into a block of units, and it had whacked on the wall above where this woman and her daughter were sleeping. So she's rung the cops. The cops come around. They arrest Sadat Salan and they tell him. Well, Sadat Salan tells them the story about the torture in the Melbourne hotel. They go to the room, they do blood tests, and they say, okay, well, your story checks out.
Yeah, fair.
And we want Nick Radev, and you're going to help us get him. And so they arrange Sadat Salan arranges another place where they would drop off the money, where Radev would come and collect the money. He says, Sadat Salan says they come from an in-law and go to his place, and the place is in Kew in Melbourne's eastern leafy suburbs. But Radev's given the address, but he goes to the wrong place. There's special operations group waiting for a very violent arrest at one house, and Radev goes into the house next door. He goes to the wrong place, and he knocks on the door. And this little old lady, there he is with his gun. His gun and his phone and his tracksuit pants,
just casual.
And the old lady, she answers the door. Can I help you? And that's when the special operations group move in, but they can't shoot him because they're using full metal jackets. It'll just kill her too. So they have a very, very long, tense process where they finally make a violent arrest, and that leads to the story of. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, we'll definitely do that.
So basically, what I'll do is we'll rewind. We'll do another lead out. But the thing is, we're at 41 minutes, and I have no problem with episodes going long.
Why don't we just wrap up, Nick, and then and then we can get back and we'll give you the next two. We'll give you the next two next week because we've got Stan Smith and Roger Rogers to talk about.
I don't want to rush those guys.
No, so let's not do that.
It'd be shit to rush them. And I know what you get like with the timing. And if we get to a point where you start rushing Roger, I'll be sitting here going, "No, tell me more."
Yeah.
I'll be the annoyed listener.
Okay.
So
let's do that. Let's do that. I'll start with the Ben Archbold story. So I'll just think. So Radev's been arrested, and now we lead on to the story with Ben Archbold. Ben Archbold is now a lawyer, solicitor in New South Wales.
Actually, can we pause for a sec?
Yeah, go on.
So now.
So Sadat Salan has done his job. Nick Radev has been arrested, a very, very tense and violent arrest. Sadat Salan goes on to commit a $2.6 million fraud on the Commonwealth, on the ATO. And that perhaps is a story for another time, but all I can tell you is if you're an exporter and you put on your BAS statement that you're owed $180,000, the ATO will pay you in about 3 days. Well, they did with Sadat Salan. In the end, the fraud totaled $2.6 million.
Jesus.
Well, Sadat is an inveterate con artist. He's doing a bit of time at the moment as we speak, actually, for ripping off a bloke and was jailed for, I think, 5 years and 3 months in June 1920. So Radev is in custody and he's chained to a table, not chained to, but handcuffed to a table. And he meets for the very first time a police detective, a detective senior constable with the organised crime squad, Ben Archbold. As I say, Ben is a lawyer now, criminal lawyer in Sydney. I've met him and spoken with him about this on a number of occasions. They're asking Radev all sorts of questions. This is the one they want to put him away for a very, very long time. And they're looking at his tattoos and they're asking all sorts of questions. Radev is super violent, spitting and carrying on.
Yeah, being a prick.
And Archbold says to him, he mentions the first murder that Radev has committed when he's arrived, the Ford worker, Sergey. And he says, I know you did it. And I'm going to prove it, and I'm going to put you away for it. And Radev just becomes enraged at that stage. He is subsequently charged with kidnap and abduction type offences, and he's locked up, but he gets bail. He gets
Yeah.
bail, which is one of those really strange things, but he's bailed on the abduction kidnapping charges that relate to Sadat Salan's torture. And he's basically sworn to kill Ben Archbold. He has taken it upon himself to kill the police officer, Ben Archbold. And this begins a sort of terrifying months-long process for Ben, where he sleeps in a different house every night with a gun under his pillow.
As you would.
Well,
Because these aren't empty threats.
This is Nick Radev, this guy's going to come after you. And one of the sort of the side stories is the failure of the Victoria Police Force to properly protect Ben, and it goes on. But Archbold is terrified, and I interviewed Ben's father, Peter, who's a publican in Toorak. And he told the story. He told the story of how Radev came into Peter Archbold's pub looking for Ben, Radev was there handing him $100 notes to put into the TAB machine and saying, "Where's your son? Is your son here?" He said, "Well, no, he's not here. He doesn't live here." And he knew it was something very dangerous. So Radev eventually leaves, and from a telephone intercept that we know of, Radev got onto the phone to a Western Australian criminal, well-known drug dealer, and tells him that he has a hand grenade in his pocket, and he was going to let rip. If Ben had been in the pub, in Peter's pub, his father's pub, he would have let rip with a handgun, with a hand grenade. So that's the sort of violent human being he was. When his end came, it came through sheer greed, of course. He was very, very keen, always keen, constantly asking Carl Williams, who was the pill king of Melbourne at the time, "Who's your cook? When do I get to meet your cook? I want to meet your cook. When do I get to meet him?" And Carl knows what that's all about. He knows he's going to Radev's just going to abduct his cook and have him cooking there. And having cooked for Nick instead. Basically, Williams tired of it, and he basically arranged for Radev to be murdered. And the way in which to get Radev going in one particular place was to say, "Okay, you can come and meet the cook today." So Radev and Williams leave a cafe in Brighton, and they head to Coburg. And Radev gets out of the car. There were two of his sidekicks there as well. A car sped past and shot him dead just as he was in the front yard of this home in Coburg. Shot him multiple times. I could name the people in the car. One of them was Benji Vanyaman. The other I cannot name. He is still name suppressed by the Supreme Court. But anyway, Radev has been shot dead. Believing that he was going to be meeting Carl Williams' cook. Carl Williams and his father, they're both dead now. They were around the corner watching it from another car. And finally, this horrible human being, Nick Radev, was finally dead. And his two sidekicks see him shot dead in the front yard of this house, and they look at each other and go, "We know where his money is." And so they just jump in the car and go and rob him blind.
How perfect.
He's dead, of course, so he's certainly not going to back up on it.
No.
Radev was buried like many of these fucking characters. He was buried in the $50,000 gold-plated coffin. And we would have seen, students of the Melbourne Gang Wars would have seen so many of these funerals. Vanyaman was another one. They all had the gold-plated $50,000 coffins. And they all had huge crowds there. But when Radev died, there were only a handful of people.
Really?
3 or 4 people, really.
Old Nicky No
He was
Mate.
so despised, feared, and then when dead, despised. And so they could barely get the pull. bearers, and you need quite a few of them for the $50,000 gold-plated coffin.
Fucking A.
You can't just do that with 4 blokes. So they could barely get the pallbearers together for Nick Radev. Such a fucking
More
horrible
money than
human being
mates.
he was.
Fuck, that's pretty sad.
And then, look, I guess if nothing else, that proves that crime doesn't pay. But
not in Friends.
you can't. Yes, with Nick Radev,
It gets you a gold-plated fucking coffin, though.
Well, yeah, but crime doesn't.
I
pay.
don't have one of those.
Crime doesn't pay, but in the case of Nick Radev, he did save a few bob on the catering because there were not that many at his funeral.
There.
This is a bloke who, while standing over a sunshine drug dealer, went to his home while this man's wife and children were there and raped this fellow in front of him.
Oh, Jesus.
This is a horrible, horrible human being who just decided he would be more violent than anybody else. And in the end, he copped his right whack in Queen Street, Coburg on the 15th of April 2003. Now, we have 2 to go. Listeners, we have 2 more to go, and we are not going to rush this. We want to talk about these people.
We're going to take our dear sweet time. We could not quite get through the full 5.
Horrible these people were.
2 more.
We have done, we've done John Frederick Chow Hayes, Christopher Dale Flannery, Rentakill, and Nick the Bulgarian Radev.
We've got 2 more left.
We've got 2 to go.
We're going to get there.
And we're
going to get there.
We're going to do that. We're going to really sad. We're going to let you be a bit upset. We're going to say to be continued.
We've done it again.
We have. It is a shame, but we don't want you sitting and listening for 4 hours of me babbling away. So we're going to get to me babbling away for another hour or so next week.
And I have to fucking edit this too. So I'm gonna go and lick my wounds. So